Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Friday lecture series. I think I know everyone in the room. I'm Farina. I'm the director. And I'm really pleased today to welcome Asher Ghertner from Rutgers University to speak with us. I wanted to tell you very quickly a little bit about Asher that may not be obvious to all. And that is that Asher did his first degree, his BA, from Colby College, where he majored in environmental science and chemistry. And then he clearly saw the light of the social sciences as well as science. And he went on to do his PhD from Berkeley in the Department of Geography. When he left Berkeley, his first teaching position was at the LSE in London, where he was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment. LSE, which actually stole him away from the possibility of our having him here at Michigan, because he was poised to join the Society of Fellows, but had to give up that opportunity to go and take a tenure track position in London. But he has come back to the States since 2012. He has been at Rutgers, where he is today an associate professor in the Department of Geography and the director of their South Asian Studies program. Asher is the author of a book titled Rule by Aesthetics, World-Class City Making in Delhi. And he's also the co-editor of two forthcoming volumes, both of which sound really fantastic, and I'm kind of can't wait for them to be out. The first is called Land Fictions, The Commodification of Land in City and Country, which is edited along with Robert Lake. And the second is called Future Proof, Security, Aesthetics, and the Urban Imaginary, which is co-edited with Daniel W. Goldstein. So as you can see, he's a broad-ranging scholar with much experience. I won't say more. Please join me in welcoming him today. His talk is entitled Atmospheric Citizenship, Distributions of Life Amidst Delhi's Polluted Airs. Thank you so much. Welcome, Asher.
On. Okay, there it is. Good. Thank you so much for that generous introduction, Farina, and for the invitation to join you all today. It's a real pleasure to be at the Center for South Asian Studies here at Michigan. It's my first time to Ann Arbor, and I had a bit of a laugh when I looked at the title and the description of the talk that I sent to Janelle in, I think it was May or June. Thinking, sort of imagining in a perspective, a vision of what I might achieve during my sabbatical. That's what I wrote into my abstract, and now I'm thinking, wow, is that what's going on here or not? So thanks, Janelle, also for facilitating my visit. I've had a lovely time so far, and I look forward to presenting this somewhat early research. Just by way of a quick framing, what I'll be presenting today is based on new research that I've been carrying out on bad air and the atmospheric crisis that's been unfolding in Delhi. And just to give you a quick sense of things, and also using it as an occasion to reflect on what I was thinking when I wrote my abstract 6 months ago, what I'm trying to do in this project is, and there's a number of things, but I guess what I'd like to say is I'm trying to think about ways in which citizenship is being respatialized in at least a couple of senses. The first builds on my first research project that Farina mentioned, that was really examining the ways in which Delhi, as a long seen and experienced sort of socially mixed city with kind of diverse class groups occupying similar overlapping neighborhoods, how Delhi became increasingly segregated through a process of mass slum removal in the first decade of the 21st century. So that was what I studied ethnographically in my first book project. And what I'm thinking about in this project to some extent is the ways in which terrestrial templates of segregation are potentially being modeled onto the space of the atmosphere. And the way that I'm thinking of this is in part through the ways that something like the idea of a fortified enclave, which Teresa Caldera, the urban anthropologist, has written about in the context of Sao Paulo gated communities, how these fortified enclaves are being downscaled from the city or the township to the neighborhood, to the home, to the personal car, and even to the level of the body, the kind of fortress body. And this is taking place through increasing use of kind of privatized purification technologies, air filtration systems, and what I like to think of or call the sexy mask, designer air pollution masks that can match your sari for nighttime wear. So that's one kind of move that I'm thinking of. And the other is what I'll be talking about today, which really has to do with a reframing of the way in which life is conceptualized and categorized in legal discourse and legal argumentation. So just to bring you into the space of this realm of atmospheric crisis, I want to begin with events from a little over a year ago through what became known as Delhi's Airpocalypse. So Airpocalypse was how news headlines read: Delhi resembles a gas chamber, pronounced the state's chief minister. This is genocide, declared the Delhi High Court in November 2016. These increasingly extreme terms reflect the awkwardness of descriptively capturing the severity of the toxic air that hung over Delhi for 2 weeks during North India's festive season in autumn 2016. In the lead up to Diwali, a combination of unusually stagnant winds, cool weather, crop burning in Haryana and Punjab, and the annual cloud of heavy metals released through Diwali fireworks, mixed with Delhi's typically high automobile exhaust load to cause a spike in air pollution levels. On the day of Diwali, the average ambient concentration of PM 2.5, which is particulate matter smaller than 2.5 microns, or what the World Health Organization considers the best metric for the health impacts of air pollution, reached more than 50 times WHO standards. The air quality index, as you can see here at the US Embassy in South Delhi, maxed out at 999. It doesn't go above that, even if it could. In the city, as eyes burned, noses clogged, and breath became constricted, an atmosphere of emergency enveloped the city, an experience resembling what Otto Quaison calls aesthetic nervousness, or a particular intensification of the perspectival sensorium in which the very medium of life is made strange. This atmospheric unease was evident in nightly news stories of residents' disorientation, of meandering journeys home, of delayed trains, and of road accidents caused by reduced visibility. Everyday life in Delhi could only be rendered as a polluted image. Hospital wards swelled, there was a run on high-end air pollution masks, and the kind of unnatural quiet descended upon the public spaces of the city, typical only after a natural disaster or the death of a political leader. It was eerie. The chief bench of the Supreme Court, convening 10 days after Diwali to hear an anti-pollution petition requesting a ban on future fireworks sales, observed, and I quote, "The life of the citizens of Delhi was brought to a virtual standstill, not to speak about the plight of the thousands of mute flora and fauna." Before issuing a ban on future fireworks sales, the bench proclaimed that this capital was smogged into an environmental emergency of unseen proportions. Since the WHO ranked Delhi's air as the worst in the world in 2014, air pollution has become a preeminent matter of urban politics in Delhi, with an array of economic, citizenship, and even geopolitical concerns becoming increasingly atmospherically mediated. For example, in the lead up to President Obama's visit in January 2015, a public health expert declared that Obama's scheduled 3-day stay in Delhi would reduce his life by 6 hours. Rumors circulated that Obama, the chief guest of India's Republic Day parade, would be sealed within a bulletproof glass enclosure to protect him not from assassination attempts, but from the air around him. The greatest security threat to the president of the US wasn't global terror, but the atmosphere itself, or so media outlets affirmed. The sense of atmo-terrorism, to use a term that Peter Sloterdijk coined in the context of a very different situation of Nazi Germany, and the sense of atmo-terrorism circulating in Delhi has given the durable suffering Delhiites had been living through, but perhaps not fully noticing, a new enunciability. This is especially evident in a wave of petitions submitted to the Indian judiciary collectively pleading for a form of what might be considered atmospheric citizenship, the speculative title for my talk today. And this has been articulated via a legal request for protection for a citizen body whose so-called right to a pollution-free environment has been deprived. As has been the case in the past, the judiciary has assumed the mantle of chief environmental regulator in urban India, responding to these petitions with an impressive array of commentary on and action against bad air. This judicial discourse is the focus of my talk today. And what I want to look at is how, in particular, this discourse tracks and amplifies a vital politics of air with wide-ranging implications specifically for urban citizenship. Based on courtroom attendance and the review of documents in the most prominent contemporary air pollution cases, I today want to trace the manner in which citizenship as a domain of legal protection is diffusing in Delhi beyond the individual body and into a more kind of atmospheric realm of biological abstractions and vital circulations. What I hope to show in particular is how the legal construal of life centers on managing risk to a citizen body, described increasingly not in terms of individuated life beings, but rather in terms of distributed body parts, things like lungs, bronchial tracts, and fetuses, and what I think of as intensities of life, such as average breathing capacity, cardiovascular health, and fetal growth rates. Just as atmospheres then, due to the second law of thermodynamics, have a tendency to spread out and mix, so has the atmospheric crisis in Delhi led to a redistribution of life. This is interesting in itself, and I think it's kind of provocative to think with, but I want to focus on in particular is the ways in which I think it might potentially, and this is a kind of speculative thought, how it might have special bearing on concerns around urban citizenship. This is the case because the right to life, the legal protection for the right to life, provides the legal protection for the suite of substantive entitlements typically framed under the rubric of what's called urban citizenship. So I'm thinking of things here like access to shelter and basic urban services. Following the apocalyptic question of how the citizen body is distributed and who it represents, I therefore ask how urban citizenship changes when it is imagined through the atmosphere. How is social justice conceptualized when the source of death is diffuse and leaky, literally shifting with the winds and gathering different compositional suspensions of matter, dust, humidity, and toxins, and along with that, social culpability. So we might think of when the winds from Punjab blow in, bringing with it the smoke from regional crop burning, how not only is the mix of toxins and stuff in the air changing, but so is the responsibility for the illness that follows. Further, I want to ask what unfolds when the citizen body is adjudged itself atmospherically, becoming not just a vital force shaped by the urban milieu, but also itself a milieu, an environmental condition, I'll argue, that is tracked and governed like smog or acid rain. So life can blow in and out of the city, becoming stronger, weaker in different ways. As I'll suggest, once citizenship is no longer grounded exclusively in the defense of the sovereign individual, a range of simultaneously liberatory and exclusionary potentialities unfold. On the one hand, atmospheric liberation becomes imaginable to the extent that common heirs demand a common cause, a humanist impulse embedded in the drive for an improved atmosphere beneficial to all who share breath, right? Everyone who breathes somehow benefits when the air is indeed cleaner. On the other hand, once life becomes an aggregate judicial category defined in terms of epidemiological trends, atmospheric segregation becomes an equally possible future, and individual lives can be abandoned so long as better air is secured for the collective. If urban citizenship concerns the conditions of membership in an urban polis or a metropolis, and the manner in which social protections are allocated on the basis of that membership, then Delhi's Airpocalypse shows how the imagination and sharing of air shapes the imagination of and the sharing out of membership in the polis. So in other words, what I'm asking us to think through is how it is that our conception and participation in an atmosphere changes our conception of the social in itself. So I now turn to the legal arguments around atmospheric life as they've been playing out in the Indian judiciary, especially the Delhi courtrooms, the High Court of Delhi, the Supreme Court, and this body called the National Green Tribunal for the past 3 or 4 years. In September 2015, Arjun Gopal and Arav Bhandari, each 6 months old, partnered with Zoya Bhasan, a 14-month-old, to petition the Supreme Court of India requesting a ban on fireworks sales in Delhi. Our lungs have not yet fully developed and we cannot take further pollution through the bursting of crackers, reads the petition, the first in judicial history to be submitted to India's apex court by infants who happen to, in this case, be represented by their lawyer fathers. This petition, called Arjun Gopal, continues by observing that studies show that citizens of India have 30% lower lung capacity than Europeans and that children are the worst affected. It further notes, as the citizens of Delhi continue to suffer in the world's most polluted city, it is the children who are at greatest risk, facing the prospect of irreversible lung disease, cancer, heart ailments, and neurological damage. As per Article 21, the right to life is preserved as basic and fundamental. What I'd like to highlight here is an emergent notion of atmospheric citizenship premised on claims to a constitutional right to clean air, something virtually all contemporary air pollution petitions evoke, and I've highlighted that in this clipping from the Times of India. Arjun Gopal specifically invokes the petitioner's guaranteed right under Article 21 of the Constitution to a clean and pollution-free environment. So there's this kind of mobilization of a fundamental right to life in the pursuit of atmospheric betterment. Now, while the right to life, framed in Article 21 of the Constitution, has received far wider interpretation than any other constitutional article, having been extended through case law to include subsidiary rights to dignity, health, livelihood, privacy, and, yes, indeed, pollution-free air, it has retained reference either to a singular person or to a discrete social grouping. The right to life provides an important underpinning of environmental law as well, suggesting a potentially more capacious treatment of life, more attuned to ecological and population health. So if we're thinking of the environment, and if life there couldn't necessarily be just single individuals. And yet, interpretations of a particular idea of a right to the environment within case law that has emerged through Article 21 has remained largely individualist in framing, where individuals have to demonstrate a direct impact to gain legal standing. In cases of environmental nuisances where the effects of pollution have been more widely distributed, petitioners have had to demonstrate the existence of a clear community of the aggrieved. So just to give an example of what I mean by this, in a landmark air pollution case that was also in Delhi from the early 2000s that was brought forward by India's most well-known environmental lawyer, M.C. Mehta. It was famously known as the Delhi Stone Crusher case that also eventually led to a ban on heavy polluting industries from the city, and with it about 1 million industrial jobs. The legal standing of the body, the legal standing of the petitioners was focused on, at first, the workers at the stone crushing facility who had occupational exposure to the dust, and therefore a remedy was sought. And it was extended only out to the two adjacent neighborhoods near the stone crushing facility. And on the basis of their adverse exposure, their health impacts, was this larger ruling made. This petition, though, Arjun Gopal, begins to shift the construal of life away from this individuated meaning. It begins by noting that the historic and beautiful city of Delhi is slowly being poisoned by the worst quality of air, adding that fireworks represent a silent threat to life around festival time. These early framings shift the focus away from the particular injured bodies, and offer the city as such as the form of vitality in question. Life in Delhi is at risk. The petition proceeds to develop a more epidemiological conception of life as it proceeds. Citing reports that 40% of Delhi children suffer from reduced lung capacity, the petition notes how Indians have the smallest lungs in the world, even when compared to Westerners of similar height, weight, and socioeconomic status. And it cites a WHO study finding that India has the world's highest rates of death from respiratory disease. Centering on the category of the fetus, a category of unborn life that many other air pollution petitions will focus on, it points to adverse pregnancy outcomes, including premature birth, low birth weight, fetal growth retardation, and physical abnormalities linked with pollution exposure, and notes worrying trends in neurological damage, sudden infant death syndrome, lowered IQs in children born with mothers, and lowered IQs in children born with mothers from mothers in high pollution environments. While visiting and interviewing environmental lawyers in Delhi last summer, one environmental lawyer put it to me in praising the rhetorical cleverness of the Arjun Gopal petition, specifically its use of the infant children as the primary petitioners. If you want to get the Indian middle class riled up, don't tell them that their lungs are damaged or hearts are failing. Tell them their children's test scores will go down. A rhetoric shared by air pollution advertisements, air purifier advertisements like the one from Hindustan Unilever shown here that was on display in the Delhi metro. It might still be, but it was last fall. There's a lot of emphasis specifically on the category of the child. In the first years of hearings in Arjun Gopal, the Supreme Court refused to issue a blanket ban on fireworks sales, arguing that it would infringe on citizens' religious rights, specifically Article 25 of the Constitution, which protects the free profession, practice, and propagation of religion, which somehow here bursting of fireworks counted as an example of. The key debate taking up in the 2016 hearings in this case, therefore, involved the question or the conditions under which Article 25 could be circumvented. As the Supreme Court put it just days after the 2016 Airpocalypse, we're conscious that we're dealing with time-honored ways of celebrating certain occasions. The petitioners, as well as every member of the bench and the bar, also celebrate in this way. In other words, we're all good Hindus and we also light diyas and burst crackers. But does that justify the continuance of this manner of celebration when the quality of air is going down the tubes and it's destroying essential components of the freedom to live a healthy life? The Arjun Gopal petition specifically recognized the legal burden of elevating the defense of a healthy life above Article 25 with its free protection of the free profession and practice of religion. It did so by asserting that the Constitution restricts such religious celebration on the grounds of public order, morality, and health. The petition was hence set up to ask the Supreme Court to weigh in on the conditions under which freedom to live a healthy life should trump religious freedom, a vexed question in Indian civil law. Before making its decision, the Supreme Court went about responding to this question by studying the epidemiological record on air pollution extensively, developing a thoroughly biopolitical conception of a healthy life. Citing epidemiological reports, the bench called the summative effects of bad air nothing less than the abject deprivation, and I'm quoting here, the abject deprivation of a range of constitutionally embedded rights that the citizens of Delhi ought to have enjoyed. Needless to state, the grim situation of air quality adversely affects the right to education, work, health, and ultimately the right to life of the Delhi citizen. So it's invoking this kind of idea of a right to life, and it's invoking this kind of broad, abstract damage. The more abstract right to life invoked in this petition, though, was not what ultimately tipped the scale away from Article 25. Instead, the court made a narrower, nuisance-based argument. While acknowledging the need to balance the interest of the vast majority of citizens against the commercial interests of those selling fireworks, the Supreme Court followed a narrower construal of legal standing, framing the problem in terms of the extreme nuisance and noise the fireworks cause to citizens. So this is what it ultimately, it considered this broad epidemiological record, but then it came back to say, how is it that the individual petitioners and the class that they represented are being affected by this narrow technical problem of the bursting of crackers? So nuisances are of two types, private or public. Private nuisances are restrictions on the use or enjoyment of an individual's property, and public nuisances are damages to a clearly delineated class of users, often a group of property owners. In either case, legal standing is typically conferred upon only a set of individuals or a named class of the affected, and the prosecution of a nuisance first requires the identification of a cause and effect connection between nuisances and the life of that named class. So if we go back to that, what I call the Delhi stone crusher case, for example, filed by the lawyer M.C. Mehta, there it was again, the matter was reduced to the regional effects of the stone crushers on the particular community. So life in its framing was confined by nuisance law by nuisance law's narrower treatment of legal standing, and that's something that held in this case as well. So this case, I guess I'm trying to say, kind of gestured toward a more abstract, or I'm thinking of it as an even atmospheric conception of life, but ultimately the Supreme Court retained this kind of narrower nuisance-based definition of legal standing, conferring legal standing specifically on the 3 infant petitioners and the class that they represented, young children in the city. While the nuisance logic in this petition was effective in winning enhanced protections for a broad citizen body via a ban on the sale of the nuisance-causing product, in Arjun Gopal, a ban on the sale of fireworks, nuisance remedies are largely restricted to narrower technical fixes. While this order, which was issued in November 2016, has been highly controversial, and the Hindu Right has accused the court of discriminating against a Hindu tradition, generating a whole lot of publicity and making this the most well-known air pollution case in the city, nuisance abatement, with its narrower construal of life and legal standing, has limited scope to intervene in broader conditions of atmospheric life. It only can deal with the narrow matter at hand. A more capacious, even atmospheric framing of life, one that would open a wide range of urban governance problems to judicial oversight, would only emerge through a parallel case taking place in the National Green Tribunal. This is a special environmental court first set up in 2010 to deal with urgent environmental matters on a kind of rapid, expeditious basis. And I now want to turn to the lead air pollution petition in the National Green Tribunal, or the NGT, called Vardhaman Kaushik. This case forcefully moves beyond the individuated framing of life central to the Arjun Gopal decision. It does so by drawing from a 1996 Supreme Court judgment elaborating the legal basis for, and this is, it made an argument in 96, for a legal basis for the right to fresh air, clean air, and a pollution-free environment. So this is probably the most definitive statement that there is a constitutional right to clean air. This earlier 1996 judgment grounded that right to clean air in English common law, quoting Blackstone's commentaries, in particular the chapter of nuisance, to define air pollution as, quote, an injurious nuisance as it tends to deprive him of the use and benefit of his house. Blackstone's commentaries extend the application of nuisances to a range of other what are called corporeal hereditaments, such as one's stream or well, so other kind of material possessions. In the context of air pollution, these hereditaments might include outdoor spaces like gardens and balconies, the use of which is restricted on on highly polluted days. The Vardhaman petition, however, frames the body itself as the most central corporeal hereditament compromised through the presence of noxious air. In other words, it starts to treat the body as something kind of distinct from the citizen, I'll suggest. It does this, for example, by citing a WHO report to note how the pollution exposure causes reversible deficit in lung function as well as chronically reduced lung growth rates. It further adopts language from pulmonary medicine to describe the urgent need to improve various lung function parameters and to restore the body to a fuller functional state. So it's as if you can't use your balcony because it's smoggy outside. What do we do to clean the air so that you can fully use your balcony? The body gets treated almost on similar terms. And in this case, a fully functional bodily state is almost always benchmarked to a kind of European healthy life. And there's this constant reference to Delhi lung functionality being a certain percentage below that of a European norm. So here, no longer invoking a discrete population category such as infants, the Vardhaman petition begins a process of diffusing the citizen body into a biopolitical object whose life is defined epidemiologically and with reference specifically to physiological norms. Mean lung functioning, lung growth rates, and cardiovascular risk become the stand-ins for a citizen body under threat. Reflecting Foucault's observation that biopolitical government emerges via a shift in focus from the politics of the human to a politics of life, there are no individuals named as those subject to injury in Vardhaman, in sharp contrast to the earlier Arjun Gopal petition, where things kind of returned rhetorically back to those 3 infant petitioners. The question Vardhaman asks is hence not whether individual petitioners or a bounded class of the aggrieved have enough clean air, Life here instead refers to a singular biological or a biopolitical entity, the citizen. A healthy life isn't personal health then, but an epidemiological norm. The very first daily order, wherein the National Green Tribunal, or NGT, treated air pollution as an urgent matter, issued in November 2014, uses the same language as the earlier Arjun Gopal Supreme Court decision to define vulnerable urban residents' need for clean air, focusing again on the children and also the elderly. So the court, the National Green Tribunal, follows the Supreme Court's lead in beginning to think of, okay, how do we respond to the needs of these specific classes of users of the city? But over time, as the hearings advanced, the NGT began to learn from the epidemiological record and speak in terms of abstract collections of organs, just as the petition does. So the eyes, ENT, and upper respiratory tracts and lungs, or lung capacity, become the relevant categories for defining the essential vitality of the population without mention of whose organs or whose vital capacities are in question. The court hence draws from different studies to describe the specific vital processes under threat from bad air and the specific measures appropriate for helping secure a healthy life. Asthmatic risk has to be minimized, lung functioning has to be maximized, and fetal growth retardation has to be halted. Now, while these specific statements may not seem remarkable on their own, I think they are remarkable when considered specifically in the context of deliberations over the right to life, because they mark an important shift away from earlier rulings, and as I'm going to argue, the framing of legal standing also begins to change in ways that will have a bearing on who's able to bring particular claims to the judiciary, or at least how they're recognized. So this kind of diffusion, or this more epidemiological atmospheric focus, is evident in the increasing referral observable through reviewing Vardaman's more than 250 daily orders to the citizen in the singular, as in the life of the Delhi citizen is at risk, or the state owes a public law obligation to its citizen for at least breathable air. It's subsequently called air pollution capital punishment, and framed life in expansive biopolitical terms by using national level morbidity statistics to come to this kind of like back of the envelope estimation that 60 million life years are being robbed from Delhi due to pollution. Air pollution, so the court argues, stunts Indian life, which is not the same thing as saying that it stunts the life of particular Indians. Legal standing, it thus suggests, must be stretched away from individualist or community-based definitions. In the orders that would follow, we can observe deliberations over life in the city beginning to concern the whole field of urban management, such that anything and everything potentially affecting the air has gradually become a matter of atmospheric governance. Traffic and construction logistics, housing type, urban climate, architectural form, parking pricing, infrastructure provision, street order. This is reflected in the fact that the National Green Tribunal has added most major urban agencies to the case, even those that have absolutely nothing to do with air regulation. So the educational department, the horticultural department of the city are now parties to this case that are asked to attend on almost a weekly basis. Under the emerging logic of the Vardaman case, then, the governance of the non-biological city, how roads are swept, how parking is administered and charged, become an extended practice of governing atmospheric life, with orders demanding action on issues as diverse as the regulation of construction materials, vehicle engine age, traffic and public transit flow and pricing, building form, regional crop disposal, energy generation, and parking space. Just to give you a sense of this, the most important, and this has been the most controversial and indeed the most impactful order, which was first passed in April 2016, it put in place a ban on all petrol vehicles more than 15 years old and all diesel vehicles more than 10 years old. Now this comes after about 15, almost 20 years after the Supreme Court had forcibly converted all diesel buses auto rickshaws and taxis to compress natural gas. So there's a precedent for judicial intervention in fuel usage and air pollution. But what I'm saying here is that there's been a massive expansion beyond a kind of narrow set of technical factors that are observable through orders that deal with things like a diversion plan for routing truck traffic around the city, a citizen warning system and mobile app for reporting sources of air pollution, a court-mandated one, I should say, policies for rationalizing traffic flow and parking, installation of barriers to prevent parking in pedestrian areas, removal of hawker trolleys from busy markets, a mandatory environmental audit on all public buildings, a requirement that water spraying from helicopters take place when pollution is too high, an incentive structure for increasing the manufacture of electric vehicles, a ban on trash burning, new regulations on construction dust, repair of potholed roads, restrictions on crop burning, and you can see, in other words, how expansive the powers of defending life have become in comparison to Arjun Gopal, where the Supreme Court only dealt with firecracker sales, right? So no longer do you have to raise a particular matter. Anything having to do with atmospheric life is now in play. In a judgment issued in response to a central government accusation of judicial overreach, especially, you can imagine, by the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Heavy Industry, the Ministry of Transportation, they hate all of this, the court defended this range of actions and reaffirmed its powers to intervene in such an array of domains by emphasizing the moral imperative to act. Something has to be done. Life must be defended. It's now well settled that the threat to environment is threat to life, right? All of this stuff is about life. To avert and prevent dangers of loss of life, all concerned, we have to take extreme measures. Something has to be done. So while the problems faced by particular vulnerable classes continue to be taken up by the National Green Tribunal, it's been increasingly preoccupied with the entire Delhi airshed, the scale at which life is now tracked and monitored. This, to me, and what I'm trying to think through, is the way in which there's a kind of emerging judicial treatment of the environment, the atmosphere, air, and life as a kind of compositional suspension of things, a kind of assemblage of life, vital forces, toxins, disease that circulate and float around, changing with the wind, the temperature, the climate, and industrial and human activity. And this collective condition has to be monitored, it's a situation that has to be reported on, and it's a quality that has to be maximized. With air pollution now, as the NGT puts it, a threat to life, life, in other words, isn't just something sustained by a milieu, but this is what I'm speculatively arguing, but life is itself a milieu, a circulating set of conditions that public agencies are charged with modifying for the purpose of maximizing the good and minimizing the hazardous. Life, then, is the compositional suspension or the compositional effect of urban governance that distributes possibilities for vital functioning through the circulating forces of air, water, and earth. The NGT, the National Green Tribunal, hence now monitors. It asks the government agencies to almost weekly report, and sometimes daily, report on Delhi's weather, on air quality, on dust loading, on traffic flow, treating these things as proxies for citizen health, alongside records for citywide hospital admissions. So citywide hospital admissions, you might say, well, the pulmonary ward and asthmatic clinics have a much higher, there's lots of activity, there's lots of illness now, we know something is wrong. Rather than going to that, which is difficult to get, in part because Delhi has a lot of private hospitals that don't report that data, they'll turn to the air quality index. They'll ask the Ministry of Earth Sciences to report on climatological projections of what's happening next week to take anticipatory action in defense of life. So while electrocardiograms and spirometric measures of lung capacity reveal the health of individual cardiovascular and respiratory systems, right? We can do an EKG and we know if our heart health is good or poor. It is as much through satellite imagery of dust and black carbon, through air quality indices, and through climatological reports that the vital functioning of the city is now read and prognosticated. This is what the NGT is in the business increasingly of doing. So that's kind of my argument around the ways in which life is at least juridically being transformed in the case of and these are ongoing cases. So, next week things might change, but this is the kind of the trend that I'm trying to pull out of, I'd say, this kind of judicial discourse. What I want to do now is to try to kind of frame the relevance of these transformations in the treatment of life, specifically for questions of citizenship or urban citizenship, is just to discuss the ways in which the foundational reworking of the right to life in the 1970s in India gave birth to a form of public interest litigation, or PIL, in 1970s India that led to what many consider a kind of blossoming of a golden era of public interest law that massively expanded the social bases of citizenship, giving especially the poor and marginalized expanded access to judicial remedy for poverty, inequality, eviction, service denial, a whole range of things. So as I said, Article 21 of the Constitution, I mentioned this earlier, frames the right to life negatively as the requirement that no person shall be deprived of his life or liberty. In 1978, in a famous judgment, the Maneka Gandhi judgment, the Supreme Court expanded this basic judgment by holding that the right to life attained meaning only in conjunction with Articles 14 and 19 of the Constitution, which define the right to equality and freedom, respectively. This interpretation shifted the right to life from being simply a right to bear life to one of equality and freedom, including a range of mechanisms to ensure social inclusion. The socioeconomic rights often considered central to urban citizenship, such as the right to shelter and livelihood, historically fell under the directive principles of the Constitution of India, and they were therefore, which were non-binding and therefore were only really actionable or if individual states wrote them into law. This 1978 judgment, though, made these rights to freedom, to equality, suddenly actionable as subsidiary components of the rights to life. In this sense, claims to urban citizenship leveraged through the 1970s Indian judiciary, including landmark judgments for squatters' rights, for the right to livelihood, the right to health, have been underpinned by a kind of biological citizenship. Popular mobilizations among marginalized classes for popular mobilizations among the poor for urban services in India have hence consistently relied on right-to-life-like arguments, where groups self-present as indigent or backwards in order to make moral claims for services to which they are not entitled, but that are necessary to correct their depleted life chances. So it's, in other words, it's a claim that I am of the city. I don't have, our community doesn't have a right to water here, but in giving us water, we gain protections that enhance the quality of the life of the community. And in this 1970s period, things like the right to water, the right to livelihood began to be granted through this kind of means. In other words, the category of life started to shift away from just a focus on individuals towards the life of a community. The turn to biological metaphors among legal scholars celebrating the so-called golden era of public interest law in the 1980s and 90s is hence not incidental. As legal scholar Upendra Bakshi puts it, public interest litigation became chemotherapy for the carcinogenic body politic, providing new instruments to heal the wounds of poverty and inequality. The range of urban citizenship demands possible in India's post-1970s judicial dispensation thus operated largely via moral claims for a broad array of protections against things like forced eviction or the denial of water access. For example, that these claims were grounded, as Vinadas puts it, in the demonstration of residence, I belong to the city, and through diffuse notions about preserving life that shuttled between biological and community registers. So this was the kind of celebrated period, and basically what I'm sort of suggesting is that public interest law expanded the social basis of citizenship by pushing things along this axis through a kind of expanded framing of life that recognized the way in which, for example, slum dwellers or basically classes that were recognized as marginal or backwards somehow could, even if they didn't have a specific entitlement to water or access to land, could leverage the judiciary specifically to give them recognition for these things. And it was specifically on the basis of the right to life, Article 21, that this happened. But if, as Venadas puts it, it is the way that notions of life and law move in and out of each other that forms the texture of these moral claims. In other words, the way in which a reconfiguration of life leads the law to recognize a different set of possibilities for extending social services, then how, we might ask, do these moral claims that have really provided a range of expanded options for the poor and marginalized to gain access to the city, the right to the city, some might say, how do these moral claims shift when life drifts away from its previous judicial grounding in the sovereign individual, beyond even the boundaries of community? I didn't know how to represent this on PowerPoint, so I was saying, like, what happens when life is like, you know, the dust that's floating around in the atmosphere? That's the kind of, that's the kind of, I don't know, that's the closest I could get, I think, is in visual form, at least. So citizenship has historically referred to forms of belonging bounded by the sovereign body. Citizens are individuals, and the rich work on cities and citizenship by anthropologists such as Arjun Gopal and James Holston has been aimed at tracking how the relevant social collective to which individuals are associated has shifted from the nation-state to the city, from the national polis to the metropolis, right? So one of the kind of key insights of this urban citizenship literature that I'm trying to kind of push and engage here is basically to say that there's a possibility that there can be there's whole groups of people who are denied national citizenship, but find substantive citizenships within other geographical units of other social collectives, the city, right? So in the US, the sanctuary city, for example, would be just a simple example of what they mean by an urban citizenship. What happens when the juridical recognition of life extends beyond, or as I'm suggesting, diffuses or drifts beyond the individual body? There seem to be two political potentialities contained within the more abstracted atmospheric citizenship that I'm arguing is being legally articulated within Delhi. And I want to conclude my talk in the next, 5 or 10 minutes by speculating on these. The first possibility, I think, is a more progressive one in which the citizen is imagined beyond what Judith Butler calls the liberal version of human ontology. In other words, when life is composed of not individually valued subjects, but rather the relational ties and vital circulations that form and sustain social collectives, do the possibilities expand for including once alien, once toxic, and once less than human bodies within the category of grievable life? This is Judith Butler's question. I'm just sort of riffing off that, basically saying that if we think beyond the individual body and think of sociality in terms of relational ties, how do we reconceive of rights and entitlements and obligations? Atmospheric betterment, after all, leads to enriched life for all breathers, even those formerly excluded from the polis. So you might not belong there, but if the air is better, you too benefit. As Holston and Upadhyay put it in their formative and their now foundational essay, Cities and Citizenship, citizenship rights expand and erode in complex arrhythmic ways, billowing in and out of the airshed like the cool Himalayan winds. Perhaps in the case of Delhi, those rights have drifted beyond the biological sheath of the bounded liberal self, opening up new possibilities for defining and defending a life in common. It's nice to think, right, of an atmospheric commons that allows us to float above class, caste, religion, gender, sexuality, right? That's the kind of possibility here, that everyone wants better air and everyone thus benefits from it. I'm a bit skeptical, though. So on the other hand, distributed life creates the possibility that citizenship benefits will be bestowed only upon those who are able to maximally position themselves according to the normative framing of, as the Supreme Court put it, a healthy life. Citizenship in this guise becomes a practice of seeking insertion into biopolitical life, and it is exercised by blocking and keeping out threats to that life, or by elevating one's own role in maintaining the city's vital functioning. Everyone else is ungrievable life, the life that can be dispensed with. This is a move that I think would fit within a particular formation of Hindu jurisprudence, in which, as Gopal Guru puts it, the political theorist, material exposure to pollution for some, namely Dalits and outcasts, is a condition of emergence for Hindu public purity. Right? So some have to be some have to be dirtied, made dirty, exposed to death in order for the public sphere to emerge. That's the claim. To what extent, then, might the defense of atmospheric life come to rest on an acceptance of a certain quantum of ungrievable life in the form of elevated pollution exposure among the lower classes and castes? Two sorts of evidence suggest the emergence of a more restrictive atmospheric citizenship of this sort. First, while many of the National Green Tribunal's orders have focused on regulating private vehicles used primarily by wealthier classes, implementation of these orders has so far lagged, whereas crackdowns on polluting activities associated with the livelihoods of the poor have gone on much more aggressively. Things like trash burning, waste picking, uses of coal for winter heating, especially by chowkidars, the security guards that stand outside of the posh gates of wealthy middle-class homes, and industrial activities. These have faced far fewer setbacks. It's been very quick that crackdowns and fines and penalties have been imposed on those uses. The Delhi government's air pollution app called Hava Badlo, or Change the Air, allows users to upload geolocated photographs of sources of pollution for government removal. And virtually all photos on the app that was operational through 2016 focused on leaf and trash burning, not high-polluting private cars or backup diesel generators, which are far larger sources of pollution in the city. As Aditya Nigam argued of that landmark 2001 Supreme Court case that led to the stone crushing case that led to a ban on polluting industries in Delhi, and with it, as I said, more than 1 million industrial jobs from the city, he says that the right to fresh air and to live in pollution-free environments, in this case, superseded the rights of others to livelihoods. Might the same thing be happening here? The second evidence of this exclusionary atmospheric citizenship comes in the form of primarily middle-class resident welfare associations, or RWAs, including some of the very same ones that contributed to Delhi's millennial slum demolition drive. So the same RWAs that argued that neighboring slums were dirty, polluting, ugly, out of place, and that led to actually a huge number of High Court and Supreme Court orders issuing eviction notices for those neighborhoods. Many of the same groups have begun to mobilize the language of atmospheric citizenship as part of public campaigns that share the rhetoric of the civility campaigns that Amitabh Bhaskar labels bourgeois environmentalism, right? So here, Citizens for Clean Air, that's sort of largely operating through these kind of neighborhood level associations that have a reputation, this is something I've written about before, for really trying to defend a kind of bourgeois notion of public civility, where only certain types of bodies and activities are invited and allowed in public spaces. I want to offer just a couple examples of this. At the tail end of the 2016 Airpocalypse, RWAs, these associations, gathered here, as you can see here, under the banner of Citizens for Clean Air, holding placards, which isn't shown in this photo, that clean air is our birthright. So not dissimilar from Brahminical presuppositions about caste Hindus' entitlement to and constitution through purity. Right? So this idea that we deserve it, we are born with purity, how dare we have to live through exposure to anything else? Industrial and waste workers occupationally exposed to high concentrations of air pollution were not included with this framing, despite their long-standing leadership in the fight against air pollution in the city. 2 days after these initial protests, a larger #HelpDelhiBreathe group congregated at Delhi's principal protest space, the Jantar Mantar, forming a kind of jamboree of parental concern for children's health, schooling, and recreational opportunities. A similar group in the satellite city of Gurgaon borrowed the language of clean air as birthright slogan and marched behind banners imploring the government to stop waste burning, to enforce the law, and to stop garbage burning. Whereas there are specific municipal laws that govern waste and trash burning, private vehicle and generator usage, which are far larger contributors to air pollution and that are used primarily by wealthier groups, face no direct regulatory oversight. The seemingly neutral language of environmental law enforcement raised through these public displays of atmospheric citizenship hence mask deeper inequalities of atmospheric access and use. Now, while these protests did not in any way exclude or target the poor, I'm not arguing that they do, and indeed there were some mixed class protests that came up as well, although they weren't as well covered in the media. Many of the most active RWAs that organized these were also instrumental not only in leading to mass evictions of the poorest from the city on the basis of a kind of false poor are polluting argument, but these same groups were also instrumental in blocking a 2008 proposal for a bus rapid transit system that would have reduced the space for private cars, thus their protest. How dare you restrict our free expression of consumer power as a new middle class? But this bus rapid transit system also was promised to facilitate working class mobility and as a major source of pollution reduction. And indeed, the most rapidly growing and arguably the largest single source of air pollution in Delhi today is private diesel vehicles, many of which are large SUVs that are all over the city jamming the place up. Wealthy resident welfare associations, like those that organize these protests, have tended to back narrow technological fixes to air pollution, air filtration systems, restrictions on industry, vehicle emission standards, and they've been most heavily invested in the expansion of privatized air purification technologies that render environmental risk largely a problem of individual responsibility, a version of what the geographer Don Mitchell calls SUV citizenship. Right? Here I am in my box. As long as my box is secured, I'll fortify it to the extent necessary, and anything that infringes upon that will receive the most punitive legal action possible. Segregated atmospheres, this vision of segregated atmospheres. One example here, this is from Delhi's largest and most publicly prominent air purification consulting outfit called Breathe Easy. It's a lovely group, but you can also see the kind of racialized logic of air purity here. Experience Davos in Delhi, where you can buy an air purifier that's about equivalent to the salary of the annual median income in Delhi. You can buy an air purifier for your home. So this is the kind of thing here that's being peddled. And there are cheaper ones too, and I'm not saying there's something wrong with this. Almost all of my friends who can afford them have them as a condition of kind of survival. But the idea of segregated atmospheres that's being imagined, this kind of techno-utopian fantasy, while it's meteorologically impossible, it does remain very much alive in the elite's imaginary, as is evident in the popularity of luxury apartments advertising pollution-free interiors, whatever that means, private schools with centralized air purifiers. So, for example, there's talk that the American school is going to build a domed playground, so your kids can be outside, but actually in a perfectly air-conditioned and purified space, and other things like what I call the sexy air pollution mask. There's a lot of interest in this. It's a booming business, and as you could see from the earlier ad in the Metro, there's a lot of this going on. At a well-publicized event this past November, during a more recent Airpocalypse, with air pollution levels reaching the same heights as the year before, a member of the State Legislative Assembly, an MLA, was distributing free air pollution masks, mostly to wealthy residents, and when the photo op emerged, informal vendors who were there both selling things and trying to get a mask for themselves were shuttled out of the way for a staged photo op that could be printed in the nightly news. So here, as in broader techno-utopian visions for this segregated atmospheric order, the citizen that's eligible for environmental protection was a necessarily bourgeois body. So to conclude, and I think I'm getting close to going over time, what I think Delhi's moment of atmospheric reckoning shows us is how what the geographer Mark Whitehead calls the atmospheric self, which is a subject who self-governs according to state discourses of atmospheric responsibility. This atmospheric self that's imagined through state and legal descriptions of the problem and how we have an obligation to solve it, that this atmospheric self is actually a collective self. But the collective that it holds together cannot be presumed to be grounded either in a constitutionally defined national body. It's not a national body that's being hailed into existence. And it also isn't grounded in humanist principles of universal inclusion. Not everyone has equal access. Life, like the air, is rather held together by what Peter Addy calls shifting affinities. So life itself is this compositional suspension of a bunch of stuff that gets stuck together that I think prompts us to see the polis to which life is normatively linked as this suspension that's sustained by different climatological, socio-technical, and biopolitical properties. So while public health is the foremost focus and concern in air pollution activism today, technical choices around which polluting activities are to be restricted are already raising ethical questions over who sacrifices and is to be sacrificed, and still more fundamental questions about what counts as sacrifice. For instance, when Delhi smog stretched across and beyond the city and caused a multi-car pile-up, almost 20 cars piling up on an expressway in Greater Noida in the neighboring state of Uttar Pradesh last November, were those injuries there to be added to Delhi's tally of atmospheric injury? Further, when industrial workers suffer from occupational pollution exposure, are they counted as victims of atmospheric crisis, or are they simply absorbed into baseline morbidity statistics, the ungrievable life that we can just live with? Shifting environmental conditions, like is happening in Delhi, therefore I want to argue, shift the composition of risk and responsibility and raise challenging questions about atmospheric life. With this comes the risk that social protections of the sort that became very actionable in the post-1970s treatment of the right to life, this expanded social basis of citizenship in India in the 80s and 90s, these may also diminish, subjecting the poor and marginalized to a narrower range of political possibilities grounded, worryingly, in nothing more than the demand for biological security. So if citizenship no longer references the individual and the particular communities around it, then we're kind of left in this kind of domain of struggle for biopolitical recognition. In contrast with Holston and Apadurai's observation that the social bases of citizenship were expanding in the late 1990s, the diffusion of citizenship into an atmospheric body may thus mark citizenship's drift away from the social altogether. And I'll leave you with that as a kind of like, I think, frightening thing, but I think I'm not too optimistic on the possibility of the kind of judicial decisions sort of somehow leading to an atmospheric commons in a way that some have posed. So thank you for coming today.
Asher, I'm going to ask that you take your own questions. We have the room until 5:30, so that's the
Oh,
only
okay.
thing we have to be
Yeah.
mindful of, I'm afraid.
Dana. Oh, there's a
Yes, what is the state of funding for epidemiology in places like Los Angeles and in cities in China, Beijing, and elsewhere in the world where air pollution is a serious problem? And what is the motivation for people to make comparative studies of urban areas and areas that are relatively, places like Honolulu, that are relatively free of this sort of thing?
Yeah, that's interesting question. I mean, you can imagine the way that public health resources map onto regional geography. So obviously, that for Los Angeles would be much greater than a place like Delhi. But historically, within public health, and it's not my field, but there have been very few longitudinal epidemiological studies of air pollution exposure in India. The recent study just came out from South India that was tracking specifically maternal outcomes of exposure to PM 2.5, and it sets up a kind of linear ratio of increase in PM 2.5 leads to a linear increase in the likelihood of reduced birth weight, of likelihood of premature preterm birth, of fetal growth retardation, all of these things that begins to place the study of Indian public health in India in a kind of larger context. But India has been behind. As another part of this project, I'm studying or going along with some of the scientists that are doing the exposure studies to understand really kind of what the unique conditions are on the ground here. But there's a great need for it. There's a lot of really exciting science to be done because Delhi has a weird climatological mix. Like the engineers who I've come here, they're like, we bring our instruments and literally the mirrors become, there's such high levels of acidity that the mirrors that allow quick optical measures of particle density become etched within a very short period, and the instruments completely fail. So they're realizing not only is there a need for funding and new studies, but the science is different. At least the engineering is different, and the technology needs are different. But part of what is interesting about the public health side is not about funding or comparative basis of things, which the comparative basis, just another quick side note, is that countries set their own air quality indices. So the WHO PM 2.5 24-hour threshold is, I think, 20 micrograms per cubic meter. In India, it's 50 or 60. So it's recognizing that background ambient concentrations are different, and in certain ways these one-to-one comparisons ignore differences in physical geography and climate and all of these types of things. But the part that I'm interested in really has to do with, and I was talking with over lunch and earlier with others about this, concerns around the Indian lung as somehow a genetically and ethnically distinct organ. And this gets used in all kinds of different ways. So one way is that it gets used to say that actually, according to pulmonary medicine, the main readings that have been done show that Indian lungs are about 30% smaller on average than a European lung. I'm interested in the kind of racialized history of medicine that leads to these things, but it turns out that actually this is the way that pulmonary medicine works. It actually, if you breathe into a spirometer, the person doing the reading indicates the ethnic differentiation of the subject, even often when the subject doesn't know that that's being done. So it's actually built into the machine a differentiated expectation for the lung performance of different groups. This has led some environmental activists, and this is the kind of common media narrative, to say Indian lungs are more vulnerable, so therefore we need to be more aggressive in finding solutions. But the central government has mobilized the exact opposite approach, which is to say Indian lungs are fundamentally different, therefore the existing science, which is scarce in India, has to be rejected. We have to do our own uniquely Indian epidemiology to prove that the same ratios and relationships hold, because maybe it's the case that Indian lungs are smaller, but they're more adapted to pollution exposure. So I hope that gives a sense of. There's a question here, Dana.
Hey, it's working. Yeah, so sort of touching off what you just said, but I had a first question before the question that sort of touches on that. So as somebody who's also been traveling to Delhi and spending a lot of time there, one of the things that has been so surprising is just that in 2016 there was an Airpocalypse. And I was hoping that you might say a little bit more about whether the PM levels were actually much, much higher, or if there was something else going on that got people's attention. So for example, as somebody who is an observer of what's going on, I noticed that there were New York Times stories that were published around that time that seemed to get a lot of attention. And I guess I'm wondering how the sources of information and the framing of the problem affect what kinds of solutions and how it's framed in the courts. And the second thing I was wondering, sort of related to that, but you just touched on it, was about in the Vardhaman hearing when you have like the epidemiologists, like who these people are, if they're international, if they're local, where they're coming from, what kind of evidence they're bringing.
Yeah, great. So on the question of why this became an airpocalypse, so actually, as far as the air pollution levels, it was an historic high. It was, as far as anyone knows, the highest levels of air pollution that were recorded in Delhi. They touched 1,300 micrograms per cubic meter of PM 2.5, which is, as I just said, the WHO 24-hour exposure. But there's a WHO standard for hourly exposure too. I can't remember what it is, but the 24-hour one is 20, and this touched 1,300, right? So the air was extremely bad, and the awareness of it certainly would have taken place, but the conditions of possibility for this being framed as an airpocalypse that garnered widespread recognition and prompted a whole range of actions, the threat that the government would collapse this whole thing, is certainly prompted by some of the events that I began my talk with. Obama's visit and this international visibility when the President of the United States is coming to India for this high-profile event. He's the chief guest of the Republic Day parade. They're negotiating a nuclear treaty, and what makes the news is that he is being harmed by the environment. So these types of things, the fact that the New York Times has dedicated a lot of attention to this, and sometimes I think slightly kind of racialized language that imputes that Indians don't know how to take care of their environment and they're somehow backwards. But it became an embarrassment. It became an embarrassment before the airpocalypse, and when this particular event struck, the media was primed, the courts were primed, the government was primed to make it into an event. And of course it has to do with India's imagined place within a hierarchy of nations, an attempt to become a kind of global power, Delhi's particular interest in becoming a world-class city. This is an embarrassment and a major impediment. And it leads to, obviously, then also the elevation of concerns for particular types of bodies. Tourists, the tourist India will hurt, foreign dignitaries, American embassy workers, and then that extends to those who know what it means to have Davos Air, that want the Swiss Air in Delhi, and that have the kind of cultural and economic capital to pursue it. So that's very much wrapped up, I would agree, in the discourse of airpocalypse. On the way that epidemiology and Western or non-Western expertise finds its way into the judiciary, the way that it finds its way in is just through reports. There's not a lot of oral testimony. There's not a lot of kind of expert witnesses that come in. So this is almost always, scientific reports or WHO or Greenpeace reports that usually the petitioner, in this case Vardhaman Kaushik, was a young environmental lawyer who wrote this. He did a bunch of research, brought it in, and the courts kind of pick up on it, and then the lawyers continue to evoke it, and the judges, as they're reading through the appendices of these reports that often are these sometimes scientific reports, but often they're kind of summaries by international bodies like the WHO, that begins to find its way into the language. So it's not as if the expert of Western science is there saying, you guys aren't paying attention to this, but it does certainly frame, I would say, the kind of conditions of speech, and it becomes more intelligible when something like the WHO says it. I mean, that moment of ranking Delhi worst in the world made a huge difference. It's not actually the worst in the world, or it might not be. It's the worst of those that were measured in a particular moment. Now they're saying that there's probably like a dozen other Indian cities that are worse, but they don't have air monitors, so who knows? Thanks for the questions.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the talk. I have a lot of bubbling in my head, so hopefully I'll be able to form a question. I guess your pessimism seems well grounded and makes sense, and that if this would be, experienced through class and caste in India, and that the atmospheric citizenship will not be this liberatory thing. But your description of the sort of atmospheric life and life getting defined in this more abstract relational way, and then the allusion to Butler's liberatory progressive narrative. I wasn't sure that was citizenship that you were talking about anymore, and that it was something else that was that it wasn't clear to me how the court had standing to say anything about this, but that what they were defining was something that, what was the connection between, I guess, that vision of life, atmospheric life, and then the differential, treatment of citizens based on class and caste. If that was, how is that implicated in that? Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't. I guess I haven't. You're right that I haven't worked through the liberatory possibility of this diffuse atmospheric life so much. I suppose that I would say that an atmospheric citizenship of that progressive nature, I mean, the way that we might think of it as being extended would be if potentially there's an expansion of kind of public health outreach and identification of precursors to asthma and those types of things that would be extended through kind of popular clinics and that type of thing. Some of which there is discussion of, not through the judiciary itself, but through the way that the government is recognizing this as a public health crisis that requires a certain reaction. And so, in that sense, I guess I would say that it's not the diffusion of a notion of life itself that produces the progressive possibility. You're right. It's more an understanding of risk as diffuse, and therefore, citizens of the city, or those who are able to claim some belonging to the city, would potentially benefit from the extension of services in response to it. But how citizenship diffuses as far as increased recognition or inclusion from that, I guess the only way I could think of that working is, I mean, thinking of it in Butler's sense, where she's talking about these forms of relational ties that take place through the encounter with the other. That it might be when you are sitting in your cycle rickshaw and you have the poor cycle rickshaw puller in the front huffing and puffing and coughing without the air pollution mask, that there is some, that moment, it's a recognition that my cough, the cough that I share, is one that this other person shares. So a constitution of a kind of empathetic gesture through that. That's I'm not remembering her exactly how she frames this. She has it in a number of different texts, but she says we become dispossessed through encounter with the other and forced to rethink our own ethical commitments. Then this has this Airpocalypse, to the extent that it is seen as a public crisis, has led to, everyone's concerned. It's not just the elite. The elite have a different set of technologies and rhetorics to mobilize it, but, the cycle rickshaw puller that can't go to work for a week because he's got to go and take a nebulizer is as affected. So I guess that's the kind of progressivism that we're all in this together to some extent. And the withdrawal is a kind of like an extreme version of that, but one that, based on the track record of the middle class and the Indian judiciary in recent years, I think is actually might gain more traction than we'd hope. I don't know, that's how I'd maybe think through it.
One minute question. It's not going to be. I'm interested in the smoke from the burning crop residue in Punjab.
Yeah.
That's not urban. That's, really atmospheric. And playing with the notion of urban citizenship, even for, Partha Chatterjee's political society, vis-a-vis civil society, in an urban context, that argument would make some sense. In a context where the sovereign is no longer some sort of a municipal sovereign, but it is a national sovereign or a global sovereign, what happens to political society, or do you just reject Chatterjee?
Yeah. I don't just reject Chatterjee. So the way that I'm thinking of this is a little bit in terms of the way that the atmosphere forces us to rethink the boundaries and the geography of the urban-rural, and to kind of move beyond that kind of categorical distinction. But your question is pushing us to think of right, the sovereign, and how remedy is sought, and I mean, in some cases, in some ways, the fact that the judiciary is a national body reflects that urgency, or that move beyond just the local possibilities for claims making. But how political society specifically figures in this, right? So the ways that groups mobilize on the basis of kind of local representation and connections and patronage and bureaucratic ties to claim urban citizenships, when the threat to that citizenship is from elsewhere, from not the urban. That also then requires, local municipal, yeah, right. So that then that does require this rescaling, and that's rescaling of action, and so in this case, this is why there's this crazy bind that's going on, which is that the state government, the municipal government, and the national judiciary are all saying this is a big problem, we've got to do something, and the national government is saying this isn't a health emergency. Specifically, the Minister of Environment and Health have said this is not a health emergency. We don't know if it's a health emergency yet. So they're actually they're denying the claims of those local groups. They're saying the municipal citizenships that are being mobilized are not as significant as the national priority of, in this case, not crop burning so much, but car sales, movement of transportation goods. So there's the ones that are saying the Indian lung is uniquely different, and in the meantime, let's let economic growth go. The Ministry of Heavy Industry has gone so far as to say that Delhi does not have too many cars, even though Delhi has as many cars as Bombay, Calcutta, and Chennai combined. It doesn't have enough cars. We all see that it can densify more, and that'll be good for everybody. So in that case, it's not I'm rejecting Chatterjee or political society. It's that the ultimate sovereign, as you say, is foreclosing the ability of that mechanism to scale up, and it might have to have an electoral mechanism for that to change.
Everyone, I'm afraid we don't have the room any longer, so we have to thank Asher for
My pleasure. Thanks.